Hello everyone, welcome back to another event of Aquatic and Fisheries Science Talks, and this is AFS Talk number 39. For those who are new, let me introduce who we are. I am Deepak. I work as a fisheries and aquaculture researcher in Darwin, Australia. I'm hosting this webinar today, and with me on board are the other board members of AFS Talks, Dr. Pradesh Sudhakaran from Texas State University, USA. Then we have Dr. Mukta Menon from CMFRI, and we have Dr. Sajina Iyer from CIF CIFRI. Our board members will be serving as co-hosts for this webinar, and please get in touch with them if you have any technical issues. A little bit of introduction about AFS Talks. Aquatic and Fisheries Science Talks is an ongoing bi-weekly webinar series inviting speakers around the world to share information and developments in aquatic science. Our aim is to bring science to the public by linking students, professionals, researchers, farmers, and hobbyists. So this platform is open to everyone who loves hearing a science talk and who loves giving a science talk. We have a big team of volunteers who are coordinators from various institutions, and they help us by circulating our upcoming talks to all potentially interested people. If any of you are interested to be part of our team, just get in touch with one of the board members. The upcoming talks are announced in our social media platforms, and all the links are available in our website, www.afstalks.org. Now, the rules for the webinar: our webinars are free to attend, but you would need a profile name for your Zoom account to let you in. Please note, we don't issue any e-certificates for attending this webinar. Please keep your mic turned off all the time unless the host requests you to turn on and speak. If you have any questions during the talk, please post them to everyone in the chat box, or please use the hand raise feature in the Zoom. Please also type in your questions in the chat box so everyone can read and understand what you're asking. The speaker has 45 minutes for the talk, and we will have a 30 minutes discussion interacting with the audience. Please turn off your webcam while the speaker delivers the talk, but it would be great to see you in action when we have our discussions. Now, let me introduce the speaker of the day. Welcome Dr. Rajeev Raghavan. He is an assistant professor at the Kerala University of Fisheries and Ocean Studies, where his team studies fundamental and applied aspects of tropical aquatic biodiversity, including systematics, molecular ecology, and conservation. He has a PhD in fish ecology from the Chinese Academy of Sciences and was trained in universities in the UK, Belgium, and Czech Republic. Rajeev is actively involved with the work of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and is currently the South Asia chair of the IUCN's Freshwater Fish Specialist Group and IUCN's Freshwater Fish Red List Authority Coordinator for Asia and Oceania. His team has described 18 new species, 3 new genera, and 2 new families of freshwater fish, and a unique genus and species of blind subterranean shrimp. Very recently, 2 new species are named in honor of Rajeev for his contribution to fish taxonomy in the Western Ghats. The first one is a species of a snakehead, Channa rara, and the second one is a colorful hillstream loach, Indorheonectes rajeevi. Rajeev has, to his credit, more than 180 publications and was recently listed in the Stanford University World's Top 2% Scientist database for the 2021. So this is briefly about Rajev's career profile. Today he is going to talk about Western Ghats that harbors one of the world's most exceptional freshwater fish assemblages. He will narrate a story that will take us through the biogeographic evolution of fishes in the Western Ghats. That is from 60 to 150 million years ago to the current state where human activities have started to have a significant impact to the planet's climate and ecosystems. So let's hear more about the story from Rajeev. So I welcome him again, and the floor is yours, Rajeev. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, so thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for the very kind invitation to give a talk at the AFS webinar series. So, yes, can I just share my screen?
Yeah. Yeah, we can see your slide.
Screen visible?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, so as Dr. Deepak said, I'll briefly talk about the biogeographic history of the Western Ghats fish fauna from around 200 million years ago until the current day. So it will span across different geological eras and about different unique species that the Western Ghats has. How did they evolve? From where did they evolve? Where are its relatives? So it will be a story about the fish, its relatives, the distribution, etc. So I consider myself very fortunate to have got the opportunity to work in such a fantastic biodiversity hotspot, because many of my colleagues from different parts of the world envy me for having Western Ghats at 2 or 3 hours drive from my home, where the others have to fly for 8 or 10 hours from Europe and North America to come and work in the Western Ghats. So Western Ghats is an exceptional area for not only freshwater biodiversity, but for the general biodiversity as well, terrestrial as well. And today I'll be talking about how the evolution of freshwater fish has occurred in this region, what has driven the speciation of these very unique life forms in the region, and how over the last, say, 50 or 100 years, humans have been doing a lot of negative impacts on this ecosystem and on these fish that are fighting for survival. So this is the background. We have around 300 plus species in the Western Ghats. And the most important points that you should take from this slide is that the endemism, which is extremely high. So you have an endemism of 70%, which means that 70% of all fish that occur in the Western Ghats are not found outside the Western Ghats. And this is not something very simple, because there might be areas where areas in the world apart from the Western Ghats where you have exceptional diversity, but this sort of very high endemism is not found in different parts of the world. So Western Ghats is unique in the fact that most of the fish that are found here are not found anywhere else on this planet. And when people talk about endemism, they normally talk about endemism at the species level. So I already mentioned that 70% of the species found in the Western Ghats are not found anywhere else on the planet. But here in the Western Ghats, we also have endemism at the higher levels. So you can also see that there are 21 genera or 21 genus of fish in the Western Ghats that are only found here and not found anywhere else. And most fascinating fact of all this is that the Western Ghats also has 2 endemic families. So even at the very highest taxonomic level, we have endemism in the Western Ghats. So which means the fauna of Western Ghats, the fish fauna of Western Ghats is extremely unique. It's extremely evolutionary distinct. And we need to make sure that the millions of years of evolution that has led to this diversity and endemism has to be protected at any cost. So to understand what are the reasons for this exceptional diversity, for this exceptional uniqueness, endemism of fish in the Western Ghats, one needs to go back 200 million years. So this is how the world looked like 200 million years ago in the Jurassic, where all of these continents, as you can see, South America, Africa, Australia, India, Antarctica, were all embedded into a supercontinent known as Gondwana. And over the next, say, 160 million years, so India from the Gondwana in the Jurassic until it docked with the Eurasian continent 50 to 40 million years ago in the Eosin, India made what is the longest journey of all drifting continents on Earth. So it traveled for around 9,000 kilometers in 160 odd billion years from its position in Gondwana that I showed you in the previous slide to the current day position in Asia. So this was a very long journey that it undertook, and for millions of years during that journey, India was isolated, as you can see from the slide from the illustration in the middle, where Indian plate is just drifting away from the Madagascar plate and going to meet the Eurasian plate. So this was 10 million years ago in a geological era known as the Eosin, where India had somewhat the current position that it retains in continental Asia. And during this time in the Eosin, we know that most of the streams, the rivers that we now know, which forms part of the Western Ghats, took shape. There were lots of geological events that happened during this time, and the very extrinsic sort of dendritic network that you see in this map, where the Western Ghats is full of streams and tributaries. So all this was, all this happened during the Eosin. So that was 10 million years ago. And this is what we have right now. The second word in my title, Anthropocene, where it is the geological era where scientists have called the scientists have called Anthropocene, because at no point in the history of the Earth has there been so much of impacts from humans on the ecosystem and on the resources. So this sort of millions of years of evolution, right from the Jurassic Gondwanan to the Anthropocene, has seen lots of interesting geological events, which has led to the current level of diversity, distribution of fish, and not only fish, but this story is also of, you can also relate this story to other vertebrates in the Western Ghats, like amphibians, reptiles, invertebrates like crabs, shrimps, etc. So this is what Anthropocene in a lowland or a midland river of Western Ghats look like, as I said, when humans have a profound impact on the ecosystem and its resources. So over this sort of millions of years of journey from Gondwana until when it reached Eurasia, there were lots of important events that took place. So one was the formation of the Western Ghats itself, which dates back to 120 million years ago in the early Cretaceous era. So again, all these dates are debatable. There are different studies that have shown different different dates, but the early Cretaceous is considered to be when the Western Ghats mountain ranges formed. So after a few million years or a few 100 million years, there was this catastrophic extinction of all known vertebrates on land. So 66 million years ago, we had a gigantic meteorite striking somewhere near the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, which led to the extinction of dinosaurs and all other life forms on Earth, the fifth mass extinction. So this was again a significant geological event that happened as the Indian plate drifted away from Gondwana to Eurasia. So at the same time, we had what was known as the Deccan volcanism event, series of volcanic eruptions that took place across the world, but also in peninsular India, which led to the formation of what is known as the Deccan Traps, which I'm sure all of you would have learned during your geography lessons in school. So this is a manifestation of the volcanic eruptions that took place during 6 million years ago. So KT is the boundary, the tertiary and the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary is the era, the geological era when this volcanic eruptions took place. So a little later, the Himalayas was born 50 to 40 million years ago in geological era known as Eosin. So there were lots of interesting geological formations during that time. So there was Western Ghats that were formed, then the Deccan Traps were formed, and finally you have the Himalayas mountains taking shape in the Eosin. So all this, the journey of the Indian plates, including the Western Ghats from Gondwanan supercontinent to the current day Asia, carried itself lots of biota. And so this question of from where and how did the Western Ghats fish fauna that we know now, or the unique fish that are found in the Western Ghats now, so from where did they evolve and how did they evolve? So this is a question that lots of interesting biogeographic studies have looked at, right from the 1930s, 1940s until the current day. So it is said that the Indian plate had lots of biological passengers or biota, or animals and plants, where the plate assembled them from the Gondwanan times. But there are also other animals that came in from Africa during this journey, from Asia during this journey, and there were also elements or biological material or animals, fish, etc., that came in from Eurasia after India docked into Eurasia, and also from Southeast Asia. So the origin of the fish fauna, as well as the other animals that you find in the Western Ghats today, are from a mix of different places, or a mix of different elements, as you can call it. There are lots of Gondwanan elements, African, Asian, Southeast Asian, Eurasian elements. So it's a mix of all this. And so this is just to give you an idea about how species get distributed, or species move from one place to the other. So there are two classical scenarios in biogeography known as dispersal and vicariance. So dispersal is the movement, or the long distance movement of a species or a group from one place to the other, where you have an ancestor in one place which would have migrated or moved into different areas, probably due to land connections existing at some point of time, or maybe even due to oceanic dispersals, etc. So it's a very simple illustration that you can make out where the ancestors were and where the current day species are. Opposite of that is vicariance, where there was a single population which might have got separated due to a geological event, probably a formation of a mountain, or in terms of land, maybe a river that formed, cutting land into two different entities, where you have ancestors in one place and the descendants on the other, and also a mix of both on a different place. So these are the two conventional scenarios in biogeography, and this also applies to the Western Ghats and rest of India. And you can see from where, or the mechanisms by which fish move from, say, Africa or Asia, from Southeast Asia, or from Europe, or from other parts of the world to the Western Ghats. So there are lots of interesting relationships that you find between the fish in the Western Ghats, which is WG in this illustration, and fish from Africa, from Madagascar, from Southeast Asia, Northeast India, Sumatra, Sri Lanka. So there are lots of relatives of fish in the Western Ghats, which are found in these different geographic or biogeographic regions around the world. So how did this really happen? So how did a relative of a fish in Western Ghats have a relative in Madagascar, or how did a fish in the Western Ghats have a relative in Sumatra, when there are vast stretches of ocean lying between these regions? So this is basically a very simple diagram to show you how and when different land masses split during these different geological eras. So the first split was between a landmass which included South America and Africa, and all other landmass that you can see, which included India, Madagascar, Australia, Antarctica, Sri Lanka, etc. And then this second landmass split into two when you had Australia and Antarctica moving away, and then you had India, Sri Lanka, Seychelles, and Madagascar as one. And then you had different splits at different geological eras. So this was how the whole Gondwanan supercontinent split into different entities as we know of today. And when, so this is an illustration that showed you when it was split and how the split happened. So all these very disjunct distributions, as you call it, so as I said, the distributions between Western Ghats and other parts of the world had been of interest to biogeographic experts, to naturalists, and until this discovery was made in the early 2003, I guess, if I'm right, of one of the most bizarre discoveries that was ever made from the Western Ghats until then, of a purple frog, Nasica batragus hiadrensis. It is a burrowing frog found in Kerala, which on the researchers who studied the frog and discovered the frog found out that its nearest relative lived far away in the island of Seychelles in the Indian Ocean. And this was a very interesting find because it showed for the first time using the molecules that there are lots of organisms that would have originated way back in time in the Gondwanan supercontinent, which would have got split due to Vicarian events during its movement from Gondwana to Eurasia. So this was a discovery that made the world take notice of the unique fauna that are found in the Western Ghats. And as you can see, the split between the frog in Seychelles and the frog in the Western Ghats dated back to around 130, 140 million years ago. You can see the scale on the bottom of the slide, where you can show that the split between Zooglosidae and Nasica batrachidae, the two families, the one which lives in Seychelles and one which lives in India, in the Western Ghats, dated back to the Gondwanan times. But again, there are recent studies that have shown that the dates are not exact, as it was found out in 2003 when the paper came out. But the distribution or the distant distributions remain the same. So although the nearest relative was in Seychelles, more detailed studies using genomes uncovered a little more recent split of around 75 to 80 million years ago, when the Seychelles and the Madagascar plate split with the Indian plate. So this was again dating perfectly with the geological events that happened during that time. So one would wonder what sort of animals would have survived this catastrophic extinction event that happened 66 to 70 million years ago. And as you can see, this is a map of species distribution in the Western Ghats, and you can see where much of the species are distributed. So, and where, if your the geography lessons would have told you where the Deccan Trap formation happens, and you can see that the species diversity decreases as you go up the northern Western Ghats. So the area where you have the Deccan volcanism events, there are very less species diversity, very less unique species. So probably it is a reason because of the volcanic activity and the catastrophic extinctions of many species, including fish. But there's a group of very interesting fish that survived these extinctions just because they live under the earth and not really in surface waters like rivers, lakes, streams, or ponds, but instead these fish live under the earth in subterranean channels. So there's water beneath the earth in aquifers from where we get water into our wells that we use in our homes. So this fish beneath our feet, the aquifer dwelling subterranean fish, is one of the classical examples of fish that would have survived the volcanic Deccan volcanism events and the other catastrophic extinctions that took place in the geological 66 million years or 70 million years ago. There are lots of species like this that are found in the subterranean channels. One of the most strangest fish was discovered by us a few years ago. We call the Dragon Snakeheads. This fish was named Enigma Channagolam. This is the first ever species of subterranean snakehead that was discovered from anywhere in the world. And of course, this had lots of interest from the scientific world. And it also proved that one needn't go into remote areas to discover a very unique species, because this species was discovered from a very an unconventional habitat, which is a rice field. And so this also tells us that there are lots of interesting species that remain to be discovered even in or even at your doorsteps or behind your house in your backyard. So this was followed by a second subterranean species that was discovered just after Enigma Channa Golem. So this was named Enigma Channa Mahabali. And we worked on the phylogenetics and the biogeography of this fish, and using a combination of mitochondrial and nuclear genes, including the mitogenome. We found out that the most common ancestor of the Enigma Channa with other species of snakeheads was way back in time, more than 100 million years ago, which again dates back to Jurassic times. So this information was also received by the press and also the scientific world, because it showed that there are lots of very ancient organisms that still live in Kerala or the Western Ghats or the southern peninsular India. So these two, Nasica sahyadriensis and Enigma Channa, both Golem and Mahabali, would possibly be two classical examples of Jurassic survivors, very ancient organisms that survived lots of geological events that took place just because they are burrowing in nature and they live under the ground and did not get extinct like many other species would have. There are also lots of other examples of subterranean fish. This is Cryptoglanis, again a very unique family. So this is a unique family of its own called Cryptoglanidae, but unfortunately we still do not know where its relatives are, because we have not been able to decipher the evolutionary history or the biogeography of this organism. So we don't know whether this fish has relatives in Africa, in South America, or in Asia. So this is something that is an opportunity for the students and researchers to work on. There's another very interesting fish called Horoglanis, the blind catfish that again lives under the ground. So this again is not subjected to molecular studies, but when it was discovered, it was observed that there's another very similar species of blind catfish that lives in Somalia, to which the people, the researchers who worked on in 1950s said the nearest relatives of Horoglanis would be in Africa. But again, this is still something that needs to be studied using genes. An interesting shrimp was again discovered in 2018 by our team, which is again biogeographically important because it's the first ever member of the crustacean family known as Urorhynchidae, which otherwise had only members found in Africa and South America. This was the first ever species found in the Asian continent, which again might suggest that this is also a very ancient organism that might date back to the Gondwanan supercontinent, when Africa, South America, and Asia were all together. There are also other very interesting examples, which I'm not going to detail. One is Rectomictus, another blind eel that is found under the ground. There was another species of the same genus discovered from Mumbai, again right where the Deccan Traps or the Deccan events took place. But probably this is again an example of a fish that would have survived the Deccan volcanism just because it was living under the ground. There are also other groups that were not living under the ground, but in surface waters, which also had very interesting distribution. So this is the most common freshwater fish that you find, the killifishes of the genus Eplocylus. So as you can see, the relatives of the Asian Eplocylus lives, or the nearest relative of Asian Eplocylus lives in Madagascar and Seychelles. And there were molecular studies that dated this relationship or split back into the Cretaceous period, around 85 to 90 million years. So again, very ancient organisms that would have survived. Again, these are also species that prefer lowland habitats, so maybe it would have survived even oceanic dispersals. A classical example that everyone talks about of Gondwanan ancestry is Atroplus, 3 different species. So the 2 different species, I would say, because Atroplus maculatus is now designated into a new genus known as Pseudatroplus. So the subfamily Atroplinae, comprising of these 3 groups, Atroplus and Pseudotroplus from India and Paratroplus from Madagascar, It was known to split. It was known to have split around 90 million years ago. So that was the concept that we had, and that is why these fish were known as Gondwanan groups. But yeah, so this is the distribution: India, Sri Lanka, and Madagascar. But again, there are lots of new genomic studies that have shown that the distribution is the same, as I mentioned about Nasica petracus. So the biogeography is the same, but the timing of splits, the timing of divergence, the timing of vicariance or dispersal events are all a bit more recent, probably 65 to 70 million years, and there are 2 or 3 independent scenarios that these scientists have said. One could be due to Gondwanan vicariance events. There could also be oceanic dispersal, because Atropos is a fish that can survive in saline conditions. So they would have dispersed through the ocean into India from Madagascar. And they also talked about independent colonization events again a little later. Rice fish, another interesting example, is also a fish, a very common fish, but where we now know that it is a fish that originated way back in time on the rafting Indian plate, and then moved into Southeast Asia, where now it has the highest species diversity. So again, this is a study that showed that the split is very old, 75 to 80 million years ago. So this sort of relationship now that we are now talking about is India and Southeast Asia. So that's the second biogeographic scenario, because lots of species found in the Western Ghats have their relatives in either Myanmar or Malaysia or Indonesia. Why is this? So there is a hypothesis known as Eosin Exchange hypothesis, where scientists have postulated that there were land bridges that were formed that connected India to Southeast Asia in the Eosin, which is around 50 to 30 million years ago. And one example is the Malabar snakehead, Channa diplogramma, an interesting fish that is found in Kerala, whose nearest relative is in Southeast Asia. And the split dates back to around 8 to 15 million years, which is again very close or a recent event where fish from Southeast Asia would have come into India, or the Indian fish would have moved into Southeast Asia. Another example is Pistolopus, again a common freshwater fish that you find in Kerala. It has a very interesting distribution. The genus Pistolopus is not found anywhere else, but just Western Ghats and Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. So again, very interesting distribution. But what we have to understand here is that both these fish, Pistolopus and the group of snakeheads, Channa diplogramma and Channa micropeltis, its relatives, are not found anywhere else in India for that matter. You don't find them in the northern part of Western Ghats, you don't find them in the eastern part of India, not even in Northeast India. So how does this happen? So why is there only fish in the Western Ghats and fish relatives in Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia, Borneo, etc.? So we now think that, so this is something that we are working on right now, hypothesis that the land bridges that connected India to Southeast Asia during the Eosin would not have taken place through the northeast of the country, as has been hypothesized. But there is some sort of a connection between Sumatra, Southeast Asia, and the Western Ghats. And probably during the rift and before the Indian plate hit Eurasia, there might have been a quick connection between southern peninsular India and Sumatra and Southeast Asia, because otherwise we cannot explain such a scenario where lots of species are absent from anywhere else on the Indian subcontinent, but only found in the Western Ghats. There's also another interesting biogeographic hypothesis that was, or the most popular of all biogeographic hypotheses, is Horace Sapura hypothesis, which explained why these Southeast Asian fish are found in the mountains of the Western Ghats. So we did a study in 2020, which came out in the Journal of Biogeography, even on the cover page of this journal, about how mountain loaches evolved in the Western Ghats. And as part of this study, what we found out was that these mountain loaches, which once were thought to have originated from Southeast Asia or Malaysia and come into India during the Pleistocene, as part of this Satpura hypothesis, was not really the case, because the origin of these mountain loaches dated much before this geological era known as Pleistocene. So this showed us that Hora-Satpura hypothesis might not be true with its dates, but again might be true with the route that Hora hypothesized, maybe from Southeast Asia into India. But with the limited data set that we had, we were unable to prove whether the fish dispersed from Southeast Asia into India. But what we could show was that the dates of Hora-Satpura hypothesis did not match using molecular information. But a subsequent study by us also showed that whatever Hora said in terms of relatives of mountain loaches occurring in the Western Ghats with mountain loaches in Malaysia, Indonesia, etc., was true, because the most recent, the most similar relatives of these organisms on the Western Ghats mountains were in Malaysia. So there was definitely a relationship between Southeast Asian or Malaysian or Indonesian fauna and the fauna that is found in the Western Ghats. But it remains to be proved how these fish came into India. So this again brings us back to whether there were connections between Western Ghats or even southern peninsular India and Sumatra or Indonesia or Malaysia during its journey of the Indian plate from Gondwana to Eurasia. So the other interesting relationship of fish is between Western Ghats and Sri Lanka, where again lots of interesting hypotheses have been put forward by geologists, saying there are lots of connections between Sri Lanka and India, which again we know happened during the Eosin, where during the Ice Age, both India and Sri Lanka were connected intermittently through land bridges. So there were, constant, regular connections of, even ancient river drainages between India and Sri Lanka. So there were constant movement of fish from India to Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka to India. And so one of the groups that we tried to work this on was the filament barbs of the genus Dawkinsia. It is a highly diverse group that is found both in India and Sri Lanka. So we did lots of molecular testing led by our colleague from Sri Lanka, Hiranya Sudhasinghe, who has published a series of papers on different groups of fish and its biogeographic connections between Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. So all of these studies showed that there were lots of connections, intermittent connections between India and Sri Lanka, and fish moved from Western Ghats to Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka to Western Ghats. So ancestors from these two different areas moved into other areas and diversified, and then the current sort of diversity was formed both in Western Ghats and Sri Lanka. So all of these diversifications, all of these geological, the speciation events dates back to the Eosin, which is very recent, and that is the period when India and Sri Lanka had lots of connections through the Pak Isthmus, through paleo drainages. Paleo drainages are ancient river systems which connected India and Sri Lanka. So as I said, Hiranya's work showed that this is the case with different groups, including Rasbora, Cystomus, different cyprinid groups, and all of these dates back to the period when India and Sri Lanka were connected together. So there were these very interesting relationships that have been proved using molecular tools. Now this is a photo of the highway that connects Kerala to Tamil Nadu, and this is what is the basis of a split or a geographical gap between the Western Ghats mountain range. So there is this gap known as Polycarb Gap, which is the biggest break in the otherwise continuous mountain range that is the Western Ghats. So there is a 27-kilometer break at Polycarb, where the mountain range, or where the mountains are broken by this sort of plains. So this is again a very important biogeographic barrier, a geological barrier, because when you have a break in between mountain ranges, there are possibilities that fish cannot move from one side of the barrier to the other side. So this was also proved to be correct for different groups of fish, especially fish that live on mountains. Because when you have mountains on two sides of this barrier, the barrier is probably a geological vicariance entity that allowed speciation to take place at both sides of the gap. So we demonstrated that this was the case through different groups of mountain loaches of Eosin Exchange. Again, the work that we did and was published in Journal of Biogeography also looked at how the Polycarb Gap has influenced the diversity and distribution of these organisms. Same with the red line torpedo barbs, the Miss Kerala, the most popular of all freshwater fish in the Western Ghats. So all of this shows that intercontinental geological events have shaped the evolutionary and biogeographic history of Western Ghats fish. There are also within the Western Ghats, there are barriers like the Polycarb Gap, which has again influenced. So there are lots of events, vicariance events, dispersal events, geographic barriers within the Western Ghats, etc. So the entire diversity and endemism of Western Ghats fish has been influenced by a lot of geological events that have taken place during different geological eras. So one peculiar example I would like to quickly give is this area in the Periyar mountain, Periyar hills, or the Periyar Cardamom hills, covering the districts of Idiki, where you have the Periyar Tiger Reserve, which is one of the most popular, Periyar National Park, which is one of the most popular protected areas in the Western Ghats and also in the country, where you have lots of very unique, very ancient fish. Many of them are monotypic, which means that there is only one species within the genus, which makes it very evolutionarily unique. So when you lose that species, you lose an evolutionary branch in the tree of life. So these are all the very unique organisms that are found there, but we still don't know what are the reasons for such very unique forms to have distributed in a very small area of the Western Ghats. So this is what we call a hotspot within a hotspot, where you have a small region in the Periyar mountains where you have lots of very unique organisms which are evolutionary very distinct. One of this is Lepidopygopsis typus, an enigmatic cyprinid, which was once thought to be a member of the snow trouts and was even called the peninsular Indian snow trout. But using a combination of mitochondrial and nuclear markers, we were able to show that it is no way related to the snow trouts. You can see that the in the phylogenetic tree and also the divergence time, that the split between the ancestors of snow trouts and Lepidopygopsis was way back in time, and it has absolutely no relation. So this was again something that we could prove, hypothesis that we could prove wrong using molecular techniques. So the second example. So all this shows that there's lots of very evolutionarily unique organisms present, and the reasons why they are present in the Western Ghats is also very different. Some of them came from Africa, some of them, as you can see, came from Southeast Asia. Some of them are very ancient, surviving lots of geological and extinction events that happened. So, but compared to other groups like amphibians, reptiles, and even to an extent crabs, our understanding about the evolutionary relationship of the fishes of the Western Ghats are very minimal. There are only very few papers or very few publications that talk about the evolutionary biogeography of Western Ghats fish fauna, maybe less than 10, compared to 50 or 100 that you find in reptiles and amphibians. So this is an area that we still need to develop immensely. We need lots of young students, researchers to come up and take up lots of interesting questions, because you would have seen that lots of very interesting questions to ask about the evolution and biogeography of this fauna. So the second, a very brief part, I just take 10 or 15 minutes more, about the Anthropocene. So the Western Ghats which had these very unique fauna, completely changed with the arrival of the colonial powers, right, from Portuguese to the British, where the entire Western Ghats was sort of developed into plantations. All the forests were cut down for tea and cardamom, coffee plantations, etc. And this changed the entire landscape of Western Ghats. So when you don't have intact forests, it has an impact on the rivers, the streams, and the water bodies that are formed adjacent or together with these forests. The other sort of anthropogenic impacts that occurred were the mass construction of dams. All these rivers had lots of dams being built across it throughout the Western Ghats. The colonial people were interested in bringing alien fish from outside the country and stocked into the lakes and rivers for angling. So trout was brought in. Lots of other fish was also brought in subsequently for aquaculture, for fisheries, etc. So these were three most important events. One was the extensive deforestation that took place, extensive construction of dams, and then the alien species. So what happened as a result was that Western Ghats has lost 35% of the forest cover that it used to have over the last 100 years. So now we have lots of plantations across the Western Ghats, tea, cardamom, etc. People have increased. So Western Ghats is the hotspot with the highest human population density and highest human population pressure. There are 500 people living in every square kilometer of the Western Ghats, and the population of Western Ghats is around 50 million people, and which is expected to double or triple in the next 20-30 years. So this is how the Anthropocene in the Western Ghats look like. Lots of developmental activities taking place in these systems. Only 3% of the rivers that harbor very unique fish fauna are free-flowing from their source to the sea. So this is again a cause for concern. There's no habitats left. Hydropower dams are increasing, and this is only stated to increase. As you can see, India is a country where more and more hydropower dams will be built in the next 5, 10, 15, or probably in 20, 50 years. So again, this is a cause for concern. Barrages in lowland areas, in estuaries, in wetlands have resulted in reduction of fish diversity by almost half since the last 20, 30, 40 years. Increasing aquaculture activities, aquarium fisheries, stock enhancement is all brought in different alien species, and these have now taken over the entire Western Ghats river systems. And they coexist with these very ancient, very unique fauna. So you have aliens versus very ancient fauna in most of these river systems. So this is a situation with Kerala where you have more than 25 to 30 alien species that are now spread across the state, and which are threatening the very old fauna that survived several extinction events and are still holding on. So this is a scene from a reservoir where nothing except African catfish is now found in these places. I did tell you about Periyar National Park, which harbors very unique fauna, monotypic species, evolutionary distinct species, lots of endemic species found nowhere else on the planet. So there are at least 9 species that are found nowhere else on this planet except this very small area. But you now have 3 alien species, African catfish, the tilapia, and the common carp, that are now competing with these very restricted range endemic species. Many people say that fisheries in small scale, in freshwater systems are small scale, but the impacts of small scale fisheries may not always be small. So this is an example from the Kaveri, where you have mass exploitation of fish. This is again, I told you the example of the Channa diplogramma, the Malabar snakehead, which has its relative in Southeast Asia, and you can see this large-scale, catch of these fish for catch and take recreational fish. So huge fish being taken, which would definitely impact the populations. So again, loss of critical habitats due to sand mining. There are no more intact habitats in many streams and rivers of the Western Ghats. Lots of multi-user issues. Rivers are being used for different purposes. There's lots of pollution in hill streams where you find these very unique hill stream loaches, which I showed you, which would have probably come from Southeast Asia or other parts of the Asian continent. There's mining associated pollution. So pollution is in different ways from different sources. And we now have emerging pollutants thanks to COVID. We have microplastics in the water bodies. We would now face problems with the items that we use for COVID management ending up in the rivers and streams. Sacred sites are no more sacred. They also contribute in their own way to polluting rivers and riverine habitats. Extreme climatic events like floods are also creating a huge impact on rivers and water bodies of the Western Ghats. So we now know about the sort of millions of years old ancient fish that live under the ground. The blind Horoglanis, Cryptoglass, the golem snakeheads, etc. But they are also threatened by extensive use of water, indiscriminate use of extraction of water through wells, mining, even for laterites that are affecting the habitats under the ground. Lots of new wells being constructed. Wetlands from where the golem snakehead was discovered are now being cleared for the construction of flats, apartments, houses, and other developmental projects. So all this has resulted in almost 50% of the endemic fishes of the Western Ghats now being listed as either critically endangered, or vulnerable. So one of the 3 threatened categories on the IUCN Red List. So all of these anthropogenic threats have impacted the very unique fish fauna of the Western Ghats. And this is what the future holds for the Western Ghats region. So this was a paper published a few years ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, PNAS, which talked about the increasing urbanization coupled with climate change and freshwater availability, and how it is going to affect the freshwater biodiversity of the world. And one particular paragraph just talked about the Western Ghats, and it said that the Western Ghats of India will have 81 million people with insufficient water by 2050. So that is not, it's just 25 or 30 years down the line. And so when you have a scenario, or when you have a situation where you will have 81 million people without water, what chance would the fish that live in these waters get for their survival? So this is again a conflict that is going to arise in the next 20-30 years. And Western Ghats is, as you can see, the red region there is one of the most important regions in the world where this freshwater conflict is going to arise. So just to end my talk, I would say that now we know that there are lots of very unique, very ancient fauna that are living in the Western Ghats, which have survived lots of geological events, which have originated either in Africa or in Southeast Asia or from Madagascar, etc. But just 100 years or 150 years of anthropogenic impacts are now creating a situation where these organisms are fighting for their survival. So they even withstood lots of very catastrophic extinction events. But right now, with the impacts from humans, they are facing lots of issues for their survival. And so this is a concept that WWF has brought in a year or two ago called bending the curve, which said that unless we do 6 major strategies, or unless we develop and implement 6 major strategies to conserve freshwater systems, the curve of biodiversity loss in freshwater systems will only go down again. And so in order to bend the curve and to make the curve go up, we need to have strategies for more rivers to flow, creating opportunities for rivers to flow without dams, improving the water quality of ecosystems, protecting critical habitats, ending overfishing and other unsustainable exploitation practices, managing alien invasive species, and also removing dams, barrages, and other things. So these are the 6 strategies that we have talked about. So if students or others are interested in reading more about the evolutionary history, the biogeography of the Western Ghats, from a geological point of view, from a fish distribution point of view, there are 3 very important books that you can look at. One of this, the first one is a very recent book published just a month ago by colleagues from Sri Lanka, Rohan Pekegoda and Hiranya Sudasinghe, that talks about the biogeography of not only Sri Lanka, although the title says so. It talks about the larger biogeography of the Indian subcontinent, the geological history of the Indian subcontinent, and how it has influenced the fish distribution of this region. So with that, I would end this talk. And so, as I said, this talk did tell you about lots of interesting studies that we have done, and most of it is has been done through a collaborative effort. So I thank all my PhD students, my collaborators, colleagues from different institutions, etc., who have all been part of this journey, and who all done their part in understanding the evolutionary history, the biogeography, and the conservation of fishes of the Western Ghats. So thank you very much. And if there are any questions or clarifications, I'll be happy to take. So one of the messages that I would like to share is the fact that we still do not have much information on the evolutionary history or the biogeography of freshwater fish compared to other groups like reptiles, amphibians, etc. There are lots of researchers who are working on these lines on even invertebrate fauna like centipedes, scorpions, aquatic invertebrates like crabs, shrimps. But unfortunately, there are very, very few people who actually have started to focus on freshwater fish biogeography. Although there are hundreds of very interesting questions that you ask, that we can ask, and these questions are, I think, more important to be answered right now, because as I showed you, we don't think that many of these very old, interesting fish would survive the next 30 or 50 or 100 years. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rajeev. What a wonderful talk. We have seen talks from by taxonomists. We have also seen talks on focusing on biogeography, but the biogeography in the context of evolution is something new. Probably not many talks we have seen and those lines. And yeah, what a wonderful talk. Thanks very much for. Yeah, you have something to say?
No, I said thanks.
Okay, so thanks to Rajeev and also to all who joined today for the talk. And before we go to discussion, please provide us with the feedback about today's talk. The link to the feedback form is provided in the chat box. And we are always looking to expand our coordinator network. So if you can help us circulate our talks, we would like to hear from you. Just email us to afstalks@gmail.com. Now let's move into the discussion part. We have 30 minutes, and please, you can use your hand raise feature if you have a question, and also please try to put the question in the chat box so everyone can read them and understand what you're asking. Yeah, so I'll give a minute for everyone to fill the form and think about questions. And in the meanwhile, I have a few questions in my notebook, and one of them is a killer question, which I reserved for the last one. Okay. So one of just general, maybe I missed this thing. So we talk about the Western Ghats, and one of the thing is the habitat it provides for all these species, which is is the mountain ranges. So I'm not sure, did I miss it? Did you talk about the origin of these mountain ranges? How did they happen to form in that way? When the whole plate has been moving, did it, what's the source of origin of those mountain ranges that give the habitat for all these? So is there any theories, or is there anything available out there, or do you have a hypothesis for something?
So there are lots of theories that have been put forward, including dates on when the Western Ghats was formed. So the dates that I showed you, was the sort of the most or the majority of studies have pointed to that date in the Cretaceous. So I think there are debates on how it was formed and when it was formed, but most people think that it was due to a geological event that happened when India and Madagascar were together. The Indian plate and Madagascar Seychelles plate were together. So that is the most sort of consensus explanation that people right now give. But again, geologists have a completely different view with their sort of data that they use from rocks, etc. The biologists using organisms, biological organisms, talk about a different sort of origin, etc.
So that was basically
it dates back to the Indo-Madagascar Seychelles.
Yeah, so that is very related to my next question, actually. So when, as a biologist, when we try to understand how these, we use these, for example, from today's talk, we are using the, trying to find the relationship or related species or fish species to understand how these plates are moving. So from a geologist perspective, how much voice you have, how much strength would your argument will give to strengthen that hypothesis or theory? Or, now this is going slightly beyond your expertise area, but there's a mix. There is 50% probably from your side and probably the other 50% beyond your expertise area. So, when you argue something on how these plates have been moving, how much acceptance is there for a geologist, and what else would they will be looking to make sure that your argument is correct and theirs, or something like that?
That's a very interesting question. So I think one of the reasons why we don't have a very comprehensive knowledge about the entire evolutionary biogeographic scenario is because geologists and the biologists have not been working together in solving these questions. So I've never seen a paper that has a geologist and a biologist trying to work together to solve an evolutionary biogeographic question. So what we normally do is to take data from geology journals or geology books or geology papers and try to match with the dates that we get through our molecular testing, and then see if it makes some sense. For example, I showed you two datings. If you remember the one, the example of the purple frog, Nasica batrachus, which initially what they found out when the species was discovered, that the origin was around 110, 120 million years ago, using just a couple of genes. But then when there was a better genomic level study, which was conducted in 2021, 15, 16 years subsequent to that original study, they got a date which exactly matched a geological timescale when Seychelles and the Indian plate split. So the earlier researchers did not have a geological sort of hypothesis to substantiate or support their claim, other than saying it was of Gondwanan origin. But then you have another study where they could link a geological event which perfectly matched with their time. So I think geology is extremely important, and geologists are extremely important for understanding the evolutionary biogeography of any region, for that matter. And I think there is a requirement for more interdisciplinary, or collaborations between these groups. Yeah. So right now I can say that there are absolutely no studies from a perspective of Western Ghats which have included or integrated geologists into understanding. So probably there are informal chats that would have happened before a study would have been designed or published, but I've never seen geologists
That's probably one of the to-do list for you.
Probably yes, not only for me, but also this is something that I think it was very good question that you brought up, because if students or other researchers are interested in taking up biogeographic questions, I think it is important to integrate geological knowledge. And it'll only do good if we include geologists right from the time that we design studies and design the hypothesis of a study. So I think it's very important that at least the future generation thinks about interdisciplinary studies.
There's one more question before I go to anyone else. Just by looking, so you showed probably there are too many world maps in your slides. So there'll be a dark spot in Kerala and all the red spots in all over the world. All right. So just thinking from a perspective of a very basic and a new researcher. Okay. So probably you also don't have a good mentor, or probably don't have an expert in the panel or something to help the researcher to do the research. Okay. So what would a normal student or researcher would think? If they get they're doing this molecular study and they got a sequence or something, and then try to match up with everything in the database, and found out, oh, I have a relative in Australia, one in America, but is nearly not possible. Maybe is more likely my DNA is contaminated. So, what sort of quality checks are needed to make a theory out of it when you have one species in Kerala and you say you find these relatives in all over the place? For normal students, what advice you would like to give in terms of thinking in a different line than what normal people think, and doing that quality checks?
I think these disjunct distributions, as scientists call them, are very interesting for understanding our biogeography and evolution. So what you said is right, because there are examples of true disjuncts, and there are also examples of false disjuncts. So I did show you examples of a fish in the Western Ghats and all its relatives in Southeast Asia. And I told you that there is no fish of the same species or relatives found either in peninsular India or Northeast India, where one would expect those fish to be found. So the first thing that a student needs to look at is whether the information on species distribution, on taxonomy is complete. So are there literature, enough literature that tells you that the fish is by any chance absent in these regions, or is it a sampling bias? Is it a sampling deficiency, which might have resulted in this sort of different distribution? So literature is one thing. I think for fish, the literature that we have is more or less good. Because although the scientists say from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, definitely did not have access to molecular tools at that time, but they have done an extremely good work in trying to hypothesize and deciphering the biogeographic scenarios, biogeographic history. So those can be starting points of what questions are there. What questions can be answered, because if you look at the literature, there is enough and more information to tell you that there is a problem, or there are issues that need to be sorted. And then obviously you will have to there's no other way other than contacting people in different countries, because without that I don't think a near complete biogeography or evolutionary study can be successful just in one country, because as you can see, our evolutionary history is so complicated that it is influenced by different countries on our west and east. It's not just in Southeast Asia. So as you can say, right from South America to Borneo, or right from Arabia to Myanmar or wherever. So I think it's important that we find like-minded people in different countries, at least one or two to start with. We needn't have people from all over the distribution range, because to at least to get some preliminary information on whether we are on the right track, we can just have a small sort of preliminary analysis of just one country with India, and see if there is enough information to move forward, or whether we have arrived at a wrong question. So I think it's a mix of things. Good literature, there is enough literature, as I said, that is available. At least finding one or two collaborators in countries where the distant distribution are recorded. So it's a mix of all this. So it's complicated, yes, I know. For someone starting afresh, it is indeed very complicated. And so as you can see, for the last 20 years, I've been doing taxonomy, systematics, etc. But only very recently, or 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, we have started looking at these broader, biogeographic questions. Of course, definitely because of these limitations in accessing materials, accessing sequences, getting like-minded people, and most importantly, the biodiversity policies and laws that we have in our country, which prevent exchange of material, exchange of sequences. So it's definitely a big challenge. It's a complicated issue, but I think with some sort of perseverance, we can get there.
That's
yeah. As I said, lots of questions to be answered.
Yeah, networking and developing collaborators is probably one.
Yeah, so I think a network like AFS webinar series would definitely be something of a starting point when you have people from different countries, or even within India, when you have people from different states. It would be good, for people to talk to each other, collaborate with each other, at least putting faces to names when they meet each other during a conference or a workshop, etc. So I think it's a mix of all these things eventually.
Now going to the chat box, I have Srijit Chakravarti. So he asks, why evolution favor monotypic species? What qualities favor the selection of monotypic species during the course of survival of the fittest, according to you?
Well, that's a very hardcore evolutionary question that I may not be able to answer because I'm not an evolutionary biologist. But I think looking at the monotypic, I can at least give you an example from the monotypic fauna that are found in the Western Ghats. I think most of the monotypic fauna have very peculiar adaptations. For example, Cryptoglass or Lepidopygos. So they are very, very habitat specific. Probably they evolved in isolation for several million years. The other example I can give is probably Enigma channa. Again, we don't know what its evolutionary background is, but we have found lots of very interesting adaptations in Enigma channa. For example, it comes out into the open only to feed. When you look at the wild or the behavior of the fish in its natural habitat, you can see that it comes out in the open only from say 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the night until 5 o'clock in the morning, and you don't see them at any other points in time. So I think there are peculiar adaptations that have been the hallmark of these species through their isolated sort of evolution. So maybe I'll get your email and I'll talk to some evolutionary biologists out in my group and be able to give you a better answer.
So there are a lot of appreciation for you in the chat box that you can scroll through. But if anyone, so there's no other question in the chat box, but if anyone else want to unmute and ask a question, you can do it now. Any questions, you can just unmute and talk.
So is there anyone that is working on similar lines that would be something to discuss? Fish biogeography or fish evolution, etc.
Sir, myself Kavita from Sifri.
Kavita from Sifri, right? Barakpur.
Yeah, sir. Sir, I just wanted to ask, means how within India this biogeography or means the river system affects the diversity of fish? Because in some fishes I have seen the genetic diversity means genetic distance is very less in Western and Eastern Ghat, but in other fishes I'm looking means genetic diversity is more, especially for catfish and cyprinids. And what other factors affects means?
Okay, so this is something that I did not bring up in my talk because I didn't have much time. So one of the peculiarities or uniqueness of the fish that you find, at least in the Western Ghats, is that there are some groups that are extremely restricted to one river or one small area of a river, and there are other species within the same genus. Sorry, no problem. Yeah. So there are other species within the same genus that are found probably in several river systems. So there are such cases where you have same species found only one species in a genus found in one location, and other species in a genus found across the place. So we don't really don't know what the patterns of diversification are, how the diversity has evolved, etc. So there are such cases. So to answer your question, I think some of the things that we have found out, at least from Western Ghats, is that I did tell you about the geological barrier, which is the Polycarb Gap. So that is a gap or a geological barrier that has influenced speciation, etc. There is also mountain systems. So in Western Ghats, what we see are rivers originate from different hill ranges, and every hill range has a different species. So we have kept hill ranges as a biogeographic unit. We have kept above and below the gap as a biogeographic unit. We also have east versus west flowing rivers. So an east flowing river may have a completely different diversity than a west flowing river. So east versus west is a good way to look at biogeography. Different hill ranges is a good way to look at biogeography. If you have geological barriers between rivers or between large river systems, that is a possibility. And if you look at a macro scale, maybe Northeast India versus Western Ghats, or Western Ghats versus Eastern Ghats, or Western Ghats, even within Western Ghats, maybe Northern Western Ghats versus Southern Western Ghats. So I think it all depends on the question that you want to ask, the hypothesis that you are framing, etc. And with regard to Northeast fauna, I'm not very familiar with the Northeast fauna, but I know that there are several studies that have looked at the Himalayas versus the Indo-Burma mountains, because, for example, the mountains in Manipur are part of the Indo-Burma biodiversity hotspot, and then you have the other, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, etc., which are part of the Himalaya systems. So I think there are lots of interesting hypotheses that you can really look at if you want to study groups.
Rajeev, is it answered already, or I just want to have and ask a question? Am I audible to you?
Yeah.
Rajeev, yes, you were talking about this northeastern fishes. In fact, you maybe remember we had a discussion earlier. Still, there are a lot of genera, species are sharing, at least genera are sharing between Western Ghats and northeastern India. So is it like that we can completely should not take the Hora hypothesis into consideration for this? Or what is your idea about it?
I did briefly tell you about our experience with the Horace hypothesis based on our study using just one group of mountain loaches. So definitely, I would not say that Horace-Satpura hypothesis is wrong. Because Horace-Satpura hypothesis has two major areas or factors. One is the route of entry from Southeast Asia into India via Northeast Satpura ranges, etc. And the second one talks about the timing, which is the, according to Hora, which is the Pleistocene. Now, what we have found out is that the geographical route, the route of entry from Malaysia into or from Southeast Asia into the Western Ghats may be true. We do not right now have the a large data set to prove or disprove that hypothesis. But what we more or less now know is that the timing suggested by Hora may not be really true, because it may not be as recent as the Pleistocene. It can be even before, probably Miocene or Eosin, because I did show you the example of Eosin Exchange hypothesis, Eosin land bridges. So there are several studies from amphibians, from reptiles, even crabs, freshwater crabs, that have shown that most of these really evolved in the Eosin, which again is much before Pleistocene. So definitely, yes, Horace hypothesis may be true. It will be an into India migration of Southeast Asian fauna, but the timing may not be true. So those are the two things. And to understand what you said is exactly right. We have lots of very interesting disjunct distributions between Western Ghats and Northeast India. For example, Ambliceps, Pseudologugia. So all these are examples that of interesting fish that we now need to understand the relationships, etc. But as I just mentioned to Deepak a while before, one of the things that we don't really have a very good amount of information is the region that connects Northeast to Western Ghats. There are lots of studies in the Western Ghats, there are lots of studies in the Northeast. So those two are the regions where the maximum number of scientists and researchers are working.
Okay.
So there's this big area, the Eastern Ghats, the Satpura ranges, the Central Indian parts, where we don't really have the sort of information that we have from Western Ghats or Northeast. So there is an acute knowledge gap there, which we may need to fill before we embark on understanding more about Horace hypothesis, or not only Horace hypothesis but also understanding the biogeographic relationships.
All right. Just one more question. We know that Polycarb Gap separate some of the southern Indian species are highly endemic because of the gap, but we know that there is a very big river in between Bharatapura. So recently we have a lot of floodings. So almost of Bharatapura also flooding. I wonder whether maybe in the future the endemic species, whatever we have in southern India, can we also find in northern Kerala? Is it like that? Can be, or what is your idea about it?
That's a very sort of interesting question. Okay, so we right now we don't have any information to say yes or no. So it can only be speculated whether this can happen in the future. Probably with regular flooding episodes, with regular floods, it should not happen. But in case such flooding happens, when you have river systems changing course, or river systems getting connected either through headwaters, etc., it may be possible. But again, the gap is huge, 27 kilometers. And I really don't know whether at least the endemics which are on the mountains can connect with the mountains on the other side. So it is basically Animales and the Nilgiris on both the other sides of the Polycarb Gap. So maybe the lowland species, yes, they may move into one system or the other, but I'm not really sure whether a large 27-kilometer barrier between two very high mountain ranges, even if it floods.
That's right.
Yeah,
right.
It may be possible.
Yeah.
Again, we don't know. So
Thank you. Yes, right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rajeev.
We have a question from Kodishwan Paramashivam. It's in the chat box. What was maximum genetic divergence between freshwater species? Is that vary with each group? And in some literature, some species were genetically distinguished based on less than 2% divergence.
Yeah. So again, this is something that every young researcher should understand, and this is a very good question that Kodishwan has brought up. So there is no general rule about a 2% divergence or a 2% genetic distance, which was once thought that anything more than 2% is a different species or whatever. So right now it is all genus specific, family specific. The level of divergence between two species in a genus may not be the same as the level of divergence in another species. For example, we have seen up to 15 or 16% genetic distance between two species of the same genus without any morphological, morphometric, meristic variations. So I think so this is a wrong notion that many people have, and based on that wrong notion, many people have now or have described species, thinking that when you have a 2% divergence in a genetic analysis, you can consider that as a new species. So I think what you have to do is to look at maybe 10 or 15 species in the same genus, identify the mean sort of genetic distance that separates two species within that genus, and use that as a threshold, and then see what the genetic distance separating your two new species are. So I think the mean genetic distance within a group is very important, and that should be taken as a threshold rather than just a blind value of 2 or 3 or whatever, because it depends on different groups.
Anyone else? There's opportunity for one more question. It's almost on the time limit, but if any questions, I will welcome one more question. It's very quiet, so I will ask my last question.
Which you said is a killer question.
Not really. I was just trying to scare you. No, maybe, I don't know. So if it's very hard to find funding for taxonomy work. Yeah. And it's very hard to convince to get a grant or something. So there are some common questions, people would ask when you apply for a project on a conservation project or something. So take the example of hotspot within a hotspot. All right. So if you argue for a project, for funding for that project, something like that, a policymaker or a politician would just might say, this is what difference it will make to the human life, how much difference it will make with our current life. So that kind of a very general perspective, the vision, and how would you take this kind of questions and make your project work out or get a funding or something that look at in a way that how you would advise to the young students and researchers.
I think the reason why that hotspot within a hotspot concept remains unanswered till now is because of the fact that we don't have money to do the work. So that itself answers the question. But it's a very important question that you brought up, because forget even questions like hotspot or the evolutionary question that you brought up. I think even finding money for taxonomy, finding money for systematics, even for an exploration trip, is extremely difficult nowadays. So I think convincing funding agencies, one of the problems with Indian funders or funding agency is that many people who sit there think everything is known. When you talk about funding a study to understand fish diversity in the Eastern Ghats, as I said, they would think that everything is known, so they will never fund an exploratory study on fish diversity of the Eastern Ghats or fish diversity of Sakura, when they would just look at, maybe Horace papers or, someone else in 50s and say it has all been done. So finding money is extremely difficult for taxonomy, for systematics, and even for evolutionary questions. So what we normally do is to bring in some interesting groups, interesting fish into the picture. Like, for example, talking about Periyar, maybe talk about 3 or 4 fish that are part of an ancient lineage, and which, if would go extinct, would be the end of an evolutionary evolutionary branch in the tree of life. So that is one thing you can put. Second one is talk about alien fish there, and not necessarily the endemic fish. Focus more on the alien fish, get money for the alien fish, and work on native fish. So that is also something that you can do. I think all of us researchers would have to act or play very smart with the funding agencies, because they don't really understand the value of a work, the value of hypothesis. Maybe not. I'm not blaming them. Maybe they think that these are very basic research that should have been done 20 or 30 years ago. Going to a river and finding what fish is there is not a work that they would expect us to do in 2022. So I remember going for a presentation to a funding agency with a similar kind of work, and they were saying that
I was wondering more like, how would you tackle those situations? What is your common way of defending?
So what we do normally is to frame the proposal in such a way that we focus on a threatened species, or a unique species, or even alien species, for example. So people and policymakers are more concerned about alien species. Mm-hmm. So if you have an alien species in a system where you have 5 endemic species, and your primary objective is to work really on those endemic species, but you will have to focus your proposal on the alien species. And then when you have that kind of money, you can work on both these groups. So I think it's just marketing your proposal in such a way that you get the money that is required, which will allow you to do both work, and not necessarily the work that you will have to make some trade-off, some small adjustments. You will have to do something extra. But if you can get the money to do what you intended to do, then I think it's packaging your proposal in a way that it appeals to the policymakers. And I think 3 things: threatened species, alien species, probably if the area is important, like a hotspot or a protected area, or a Ramsar wetland. So all these, if you give it a global importance, if you give it an international.
I was just trying to open up the reality of a taxonomist life behind the scenes.
There's no money for taxonomy.
Yeah. I mean, students should know what they are going to face,
Yes, definitely. So I don't think with just focusing on just a taxonomic study, you will not get much money from funding agencies. Probably some money from universities, research organizations, yes. But from a competitive funding agency, for a competitive grant, it is, I would say, impossible to get money for just a conventional taxonomic or systematic study. So unless you include words like evolutionary biogeography, or so even for a phylogenetic study, things have changed so much that even journals do not accept papers with 4 or 5 genes, because now phylogenomics and no more phylogenetics.
Yeah.
So, and we don't have that kind of money to do whole genomes for 15 or 20 fish to answer a very small question in biogeography. So I think the world is changing, and we will have to adjust accordingly. Be smarter, package ourselves more smarter.
Yeah, that's a reality. Okay. So I will wind up the talk here. Thanks to everyone for joining in. It's almost 1.5 hours, and that's what I told Rajeev to, bear with us. Maybe you have to go home.
So I think if this would at least encourage a few people, irrespective of the limitations that we just talked about, to venture into systematics, biogeography, evolutionary history, etc. I think there are lots of very, very, very interesting questions.
But the hurdles you're talking was not just for any taxonomies, for probably any other project. There'll be other areas of difficulties. So it's
yes, it is the same for every
yeah.
field. So nothing is easy these days.
Yeah. So thanks very much. And if you have 1 minute, please fill the feedback form. The link is in the chat box. And I'll see you after 2 weeks for another interesting talk. And Rajeev can probably attend some of our talks. Or at least he can encourage his students to attend.
Yeah, that is sure. So I'll do that. But I do catch up on the YouTube videos.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I do. I've seen most of them. So yes.
All right.
So thanks once again. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. And of course, this talk is recorded and it will be up on YouTube maybe after 3 weeks. Yeah. Thank you.